Let's see if I share screens. This will stop. Okay, can you see it now?
I guess I was on mute.
Okay, yes, you.
That's the saying of 2020, isn't it? Welcome, Ira Winkler, the CEO of Secure Mentem. Ira is going to speak today on You Can Stop Stupid. So Ira, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, John. I think I only have a half hour or give or take, so I have to be somewhat efficient with my time. So anyway, oh, go ahead.
45 minutes, up to 45 minutes.
Okay. Well, hopefully life will be grand then. So anyway, let's do this. I think I've told this story before to the CornCon crowd, but it's so iconic. I'm going to tell it again, and let's assume people haven't heard it before. But one time I was doing a security assessment espionage simulation where I had to essentially go ahead and we were infiltrating a company, and I had a tech guy with me, hackerish type. And I told him, here's the deal. We're going to walk into the facility during the morning rush hour. We're going to kind of follow people in, and everybody's going to be essentially angling to the left. We're going to go with them. There is a receptionist in the middle of this large lobby, and we're just going to try to ignore her as best we can. So anyway, starts out, we go in, and we have to like get up in an elevator. The elevator has card swipes, but of course, everybody at that time is swiping pretty much every floor. So we just decide to get out on the third floor, find an empty conference room. I pick up the phone, I call people up and say, hi, I'm the CIO. I need contractors to get badges. Where do I send them? And anyway, after being transferred around a couple times, a woman says, send them down to the front lobby desk. So me and my accomplice go down there, and then the receptionist is like, I tried to stop you two. You two went by. I'm like, oh, we were just talking. I'm sorry. I didn't know we had to check in. She's like, oh, don't worry. You look busy. And she's like, you're here now anyway. I go, yes, we are. And so I go, well, we need badges, and we were told to come see you. And she's like, yeah, hold on a second. And she calls a guard. The guard comes over and she tells the guard, these gentlemen need badges. Can you please give it to them? So the guard takes us to the guard room, kind of off the lobby. And we walk in there and we get our pictures taken. And the guard goes, so what do you two guys do? I go, the computer stuff. Guard then goes, oh, do you need server room access? I go, as a matter of fact, we sure do. And the guard tells us, well, here's the badges, the server room access, not sure when it's going to be, when the computer's going to refresh, but probably within a couple hours you'll have access. So anyway, around lunchtime, because, give or take, this was about still 9 o'clock in the morning, around lunchtime specifically because we knew nobody would, as few people as likely would be there, we went around the basement and just tried swiping the card until we finally found until it finally unlocked, because we assumed the server room was in the basement. We walked in and we found all these admin systems, like for example, the Windows primary domain controller, logged on, no screensavers, logged on as admin. We just went ahead, added a new admin user, and then left, and we basically then had full control of their network for all practical purposes. So we did other stuff, but in a little while later, I wrote up my report, and along that report, essentially, I described the situation at a high level. And then what happened was 3 weeks later, I got a call from some guy who says, I'm the facility manager. I need to know the name of the guard who gave you the badge. I'm like, what? He's like, I need to know the name of the guard who gave you a badge. I go, I'm not telling you. He's like, what do you mean you're not telling me? I'm in charge of this bill. I go, honestly, I have no idea who the hell you are. But fundamentally, even if you are who you say you are, the only person I report to is the CIO. And if the CIO asks me for the name of the guard who gave me the badge, I'll give it to him. But at the same time, you should know that if he does ask me that, when I give him the name, I'll say the fact this person gave me the badge was not good. The fact you have no idea who it is infinitely worse. So of course you can imagine I never heard from the CIO. Now, what everybody thinks is the moral was, well, everybody laughs at the guard for, offering us server room access. But really, was the guard really that stupid? I mean, that's why it's funny, because you think the guard's stupid. But the reality is like, what did the guard do? The guard did exactly what you would expect the guard to do in this environment, which was listen to the nice woman who told everybody who gets badges and who doesn't. And then the server room access, whose fault is it that there was no, for example, authorization string to go ahead and provide access to sensitive areas within the organization? This is how it was just done. And the guard did nothing that any other guard probably wouldn't have done. Not because the guards were stupid, but that's just because the whole environment. So in this case, yeah, no, I'm not talking about a stupid user. Everybody thinks stupid security guard. Again, it's not the people, the end people, like the guard or the user. It's the systems in place that are the stupid things. And this is really what the presentation is going to focus on. So anyway, let's hope I can do this without screwing things up. Okay, there we go. So anyway, what is stupid? Looking at the dictionary definition, there is a dictionary definition, which is having or showing a great lack of intelligence or common sense. Now, stop to think about it. And, this is logical, but do you hire people with a great lack of intelligence? Again, do you go out and assume that I'm going to hire somebody who's stupid, for lack of a better term? Do they have a great lack of intelligence? And if you do, and you put these people in a position of responsibility that could cause significant damage, again, whose fault is that and who's really stupid? Likewise, for common sense, if you see me before, I live by the motto, there is no common sense without common knowledge. And if you're not giving people common knowledge, that's your fault. If you do, that's one thing. But the reality is, most people don't have the common knowledge that a cybersecurity professional would. And I'll be upfront with you. I've dealt with cybersecurity people who don't have as much common knowledge as you would like to assume as well. But either way, if somebody is acting stupid, did you give them the training? Do you expect these people to failing? Because here's the reality. It is common knowledge people will fail. It is therefore common sense that at any given time, with phishing, for example, 4% of the users will click on a phishing message. It doesn't matter. This whole concept of the human firewall is laughable because 4% of the time, according to the Verizon DBIR, it's gonna fail. Now, again, if it's common knowledge that people are gonna exercise a lack of common sense, again, whose fault is it? Even assuming you gave them common knowledge, you have to assume they will fail. And the reality is, and I don't think I talk about this, but people are going to fail for a variety of different reasons. And lack of awareness, lack of common sense is not always the primary reason. So anyway, who's the stupid one when it comes down to it? The users or the, I'm not going to say you, because you all are just truly paragons of security virtue. But the reality is that your organizations are probably the people making people stupid. Now, here's the thing. It's not about you. If you're a cybersecurity professional, you listen and you read stuff and all this, you've been fed a whole bunch of ignorant crap. Every awareness company out there, give or take, even the good ones, tends to have, they advertise creating the human firewall. When you hear things like this, what are you going to assume? You hear companies and you hear all these people in the awareness industry, pontificating how your users should be your last line of defense, or they should be the first line of defense, or they should be the first and last line of defense at the same time. I call this bro science. If you work out, and there's a whole terminology regarding going to a gym. And it's like you have the bros in the gym. It's like more protein, bro, lift heavy, bro, few reps, lift heavy type of stuff. That's bro science. Not that, and if this is really right, it's just passed on from one of the bros to the other. This is how the awareness industry pretty much is. Again, you hear these platitudes about the users and what you should be doing. and you're basically hearing broscience from people about psychology and all this, and those aren't really great sciences to look at, and I'll cover why in a bit. But anyway, here's the reality of the situation, and here's why all of this is bad. When you hear the human firewall is your last line of defense and everything, people are focusing on the proximity of the error. In other words, they are saying that because a user makes a mistake, the solution is in the user. And frankly, let's be real, the user might not be making a mistake. The user can be malicious. The user might know that they're doing something wrong, but they don't have the time to do it right. For example, locking up the desk at the end of the day. Maybe they have to run to the daycare to pick them up so they won't be fined $10 a minute, which is what happens around me apparently. But when you focus on the proximity of the error, you have issues, because rarely is the proximity of the error the solution nor the cause of the actual error itself. So let's talk about that, because, you know, it's kind of like saying, I've showed this before, but it's like saying if a canary dies in a coal mine, the solution is healthier canaries. The reality is it's a canary's job to die before everything. Oh, I shouldn't say a job, but let's just say it's a canary's fate that they are the first thing to die in a coal mine should there be poisonous gas. And it's not the canary's fault. It's the fault of the entire environment. Likewise, it's not the user's fault. It's the fault of the environment that they're forced to work within in an organization. So now here's Newman. A lot of people hopefully remember Newman from the TV show Seinfeld, and Newman himself is actually irrelevant to this, but I wanted a cool, memorable image for the field of accounting. And why is that? Stop and think. How would it be if a CFO walks into the boardroom and says, okay, we've had a $10 million loss because a user did something wrong, and, you know, you can't blame the user, you know, you can't stop stupid and all this stuff. The CFO would be fired in a heartbeat. Why? What is the job of a CFO? The job of a CFO is to ensure financial processes are seamless and work well. More important, when you implement financial process, you're going ahead and you're implementing a system in place that basically categorizes all incoming, you know, financial data. It goes ahead and, let's face it, you assume a user is involved in inputting or somehow using financial resources along the way. But that doesn't mean that the system is reliant upon the user being the pivotal point in the whole process, doing it correctly. Simultaneously, they also go ahead and have audits, they have forensic accounting, they're looking to make sure everything resolves appropriately in the end. They don't just go ahead and randomly do things like, say, a user is our paragon of virtue and our whole accounting system relies upon the user being aware. Again, a CFO would be fired in a heartbeat for making their users the first and last line of defense of good accounting practices. You know, here's another thing a lot of people don't know, and I maybe some people do, but I'm a scuba instructor, a master scuba diver trainer. It's actually, you know, an open water scuba instructor with some more skills and specializations and a base number of certifications that I perform for people. And essentially what happens is when I certify people, and this is an example of like a group of students potentially being, you know, taking their skills test. And the first time I ever heard the expression, you can't, C-A-N''T, stop stupid, was when I was actually taking my open water scuba instructor class. And the course director who was teaching us, he goes, you know, you can't stop stupid. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? This whole course is us attempting to stop stupid. Because when you think about scuba instruction, you know, the first thing we do is we have students fill out a medical evaluation to make sure they don't just have a heart attack. We try to go ahead and we make sure that they're comfortable in the water. So we put them in a pool and see if they could float for a period of time and can swim for at least 25, 50 yards. I forgot the exact number. And so that way, you know, they're not going to freak out in the water when they have to do things. Then after that, we go ahead, we give them, like, they have to take hours and hours of online training, which is essentially safety procedures and how not to get killed in theory. So then you go ahead and they have that. Then you have to give them a test to make sure they've absorbed enough. I mean, frankly, they're given a test online, but a good instructor also gives them a test in person to make sure somebody didn't take the test for them. Then you bring them into the water, and you don't just throw them in the middle of the ocean. You bring them into the water at the 5-foot mark inside a pool, just enough where, well, actually 3 feet usually, just enough so that they can like kneel down and get their heads underwater and see who can freak out. Likewise, the equipment's been inspected and so on. Then once you see everybody looks comfortable, you let them slowly go down from the shallow end. They slowly go down to the deep end, and you watch them again. Even in the deep end, usually the pool's 10, maybe 15 feet at the most, can't really do much harm. Then assuming they take all their skills and you go through their skills and everything, then finally you take them to be open water certified. And this is an example of people being open water certified, where you bring them to a platform. The platform's usually give or take about 15 feet, but never more than 30 feet. Again, almost impossible for somebody to harm themselves in 30 feet of water. Can be done, but if you're being watched and everything, usually they can't do too much harm. And then, you know, everybody's there, and then you're going through one at a time. Now, also, when I'm in the water, one thing that's not as obvious, and it's hard to see on this slide, but there's somebody watching, and I always make sure I bring in an assistant instructor or a dive master, just so that they can watch everybody. Because one time, for example, you know, I'm there in a position like this where I'm the person watching one student do a skill, and then I notice in the corner of my eye another student decides, I'm going to look under the platform and see what's there. And I start going over there, but the dive master has already caught them. Because why? Because somebody's going to do something they're not supposed to. And then, you know, you think about it, but even after that, so even underwater, we're working, watching people and so on. But that's not even it. We also have insurance. We know where the local hospitals are. The facility has insurance. The school has insurance. The instructor has insurance. We even take out insurance policies on the students, but just in case they get injured. That's standard practice in the dive industry too. So the whole issue about scuba diving, there's a gazillion ways you could probably get hurt. The reality, though, is because of all the processes in place and expecting a user or diver to do something stupid, diving is statistically safer than bowling. That's actually a true story. But anyway, so then this brings up the whole related issue of safety science. There is a science of safety science. And fundamentally, they look at why somebody gets injured. And a user is considered as much a part of the system as a computer when you apply that to cybersecurity. The computer is the system, the file servers are the system, the user is just an entry point into the system. And when they look at things from a safety science perspective, they see the results of failure and they look at it comprehensively. If a user injures themselves in a company, in a manufacturing environment, they look at that as a failure of the entire system, not of the user. Because the entire system did not, frankly, the entire system enabled them to be injured, but then allowed the injury to actually happen. So again, they look at the humor is just the proximity of the error, and the error itself is just a symptom. And that's a critical aspect. Clearly, when a user makes a mistake in cybersecurity, it's a symptom of a failure of the whole system. And this is something you really, really got to get across. But user error, where we go, it's just a symptom of what's wrong with the computing systems that we are supposed to support. Now, taking this to the extreme, if you look at it from a safety science perspective, these are 737 jets, and the 737 jets theoretically, specifically 737 MAX jets. You can tell by the shape of the winglets. Anyway, obviously these are all parked. Why? Because 737 MAX jets had a tendency to aim themselves into the ground. Now, when this first happened, everybody guessed it must be the pilots. Was this pilot error? Because airplanes like a 737, they don't just aim themselves into the ground, so clearly it must be the pilot, right? And then you stop and think, well, right now you should know the real answer based on what I'm saying, but the reality is, could the pilots have saved the plane? The answer is yes, but the problem was initiated years before this, when they started redesigning the software on the 737 MAX for the 737 MAX jets, you know, compared to the original 737, you know, 200, 800, 900 series airplanes. And what happened was, and the reason these accidents occurred was that these 737 jets have AOAs, angle of attack sensors on the side of planes. I don't know if Mike Doherty's listening now, but anyway, he can verify or he can criticize, whichever is applicable. But the reality of the situation is that in the past versions of the jets, there were warnings if the angle of attacks on each side of the planes disagreed. And what happened was they assumed they gave out a warning and they assumed pretty much not a bad situation. But with the 737 MAX jets, they reprogrammed the system. And first off, they took away the warning indicator by default that said the two AOAs on either side of the plane were disagreeing with each other. That was number one. Pilots weren't made aware of that because they never implemented the training, because training, they said, these are 737s, they're similar enough, you could just read a document for the differences. And that if that was reflected in the documents, it was not reflected well. So that was another issue. And then the warning lights went out, and pilots did actually save these planes because the autopilot, again, saw these 730s, the AOAs disagreeing. They assumed the plane was going down. And if you're not familiar with the applicable sciences, when a plane starts going down for whatever reason, the way to fix the situation is to make the plane go faster, because faster planes generate more lift. And the way to do that quickly is to angle the plane down, and that increases the speed, which then can in turn increase the lift and get the planes heading back up. This, however, was the autopilots were, however, saying, okay, we're going to speed up the plane. And what happened was they aimed themselves down. Pilots saw what was going on. They turned off the autopilot, took control, got everything handled. Then they turned the autopilot back on, and boom, planes headed back down again. Pilots were left really, really confused. Is this what you want in a situation for the pilots? Could the pilots have saved it? Theoretically, if they anticipated every problem, possibly. Was the pilot really the problem? No, the problems were systematic, and the pilots just failed across the board as part of the system. They did everything right that they were trained to in general, but there were things they were never informed of. So where does blame usually fall? Or where should it fall? The usual fault that everybody assumes is like it's the user, you know, user fault, but that's really only 10% of actual problem. The environment is 90% of the problem. Even looking at the 737 MAX jet issue, for example, it was the software that caused the whole failure of the system. It wasn't just all of a sudden the plane decided to head down. It was the software, it was the environment. The plane was operating fine. It was the software environment that took the system down. But anyway, you know, in cybersecurity, you look at where things happen. You look in safety science, where things happen. So for example, safety science, you know, they look at the injuries that occur. They find that 90% of the injuries occurred in, for example, manufacturing environments because of the systems in place, because of the design of the equipment. You know, there was one case where I was doing an awareness program for a manufacturing, actually it was, I can't name them, but, you know, let's just say they were a manufacturing organization, and they ended up, you know, having, for example, heavy wrenches fall on people. They solved the problem by drawing the silhouette of where a wrench is supposed to be when not in use. Ironically, not only did they go ahead and stop those errors from happening, or for the injuries from happening because the things were put in place, it also stopped the theft of a lot of hand tools, because now very quickly at the end of the day, you could see if the tool was there or if the tool was not there. So that was actually what do you call it? A side effect, a good side effect of everything. But then the user, for whatever reason, is involved 10% of the time, or usually at fault at 10% of the time. What is that 10%? Could be carelessness. In other words, they know what to do, but they just don't do it. It could be blatant ignorance or the lack of training, same thing. More important, it could be malice. The user could intend to do something wrong. And if you look at the DBIR again, the DBIR kind of finds that 28% of all incidents occur because of malicious activity by an authorized user. So that's critical to understand. But the 10% as a whole, this is where awareness and training might fit in. You know, telling people what they should be doing, how they should be doing it, maybe providing extra motivation on why they should be doing it, even if they think they don't have the time to do it. But that's still only 10% of the problem. And here's, you might have seen this before, but awareness, this is applied behavioral science. At the end of the day, though, and this is a critical factor for those trying to solve the user error or the user action problem, and I'm going to call it user action for now, and then we'll talk about another phrase in another slide or two. But you know, stopping user action, the way this happens in applied behavioral science, when you consider it, you have an antecedent. Antecedent in our world is awareness training. You know, something that is supposed to get the users to behave in a given acceptable way. And then, so you give them information, for example, how to do things right, and then you tell the user, please do things right. They're left to their own devices. And when they behave in a given way, they then have a consequence of one form or another. Now, the concept is the consequence could be good, bad, or neutral. So one thing we tell users is not to reuse their personal passwords with their work password, or, you know, as their business password. And think about it this way. We tell a user, go ahead, you know, don't reuse your password. Let's face it, they do. What is the consequence for reusing a personal password as the business password? 99.9% of the time, there is no consequence. And that means it's a positive consequence. Why? Because they have one less password to remember. And so they're more likely, when they have to use passwords again, to keep using the same password. The only time there's a negative consequence in order that will get them to change it, if, for example, their account, their user ID and password ends up on you've been pawned, and somebody figures it out and starts doing this. This was the case, for example, I think it was about a year ago or so, when when hackers were breaking into people's home networks and talking to people's children if they were using the Ring system, where parents put Ring cameras inside their house to watch their kids. And what happened was they reused their passwords from other sites for their Ring account. In other words, they had their basic email address that they use on all their internet accounts. They then had a password that they kept reusing on multiple accounts. And what happened was, all of a sudden, they were reusing these passwords. Somebody sees these hacked passwords and starts trying to just guess it on the Ring site. And then they got access to accounts, and then they could, you know, go ahead and look at the cameras inside the house, as well as interact with people. So they would see children on these accounts, or sorry, children in their bedroom, and they would start talking to the children in the bedroom. That's a negative consequence, and that was maybe getting people to change their behavior, hopefully. But really, you gotta understand, awareness, 20% of the potential problem. 80% of changing people's behavior or influencing behavior, not changing it, but influencing behavior, is based upon consequences. It's not based upon an awareness program. So remember that. Now let's talk about the concept of boom. And I mentioned this before, but boom is a counterterrorism principle. Basically, you have left a boom, boom, and right a boom. Left a boom are those steps that that lead up to a terrorism attack. Boom is essentially the attack itself. Right a boom is mitigating the damage or catching the bad guys, whatever the case is, from a terrorism attack. So you look at it, and what's there in counterterrorism? Left a boom, we're talking prevention. In other words, what you're trying to do in left a boom is you're going ahead and figure out who are the potential bad guys who might do us harm. You collect intelligence on them, you figure out if you want to go arrest them, you want to blow them up, you want to do whatever you want to do to stop these bad people from existing. or at least launching an attack against you. Then simultaneously, you figure out, wait a second, I'm not going to be able to stop everyone, but at least let me try to put in protection for likely targets. And so I'm going to go ahead and one case, for example, in the September 11th bombings, a lot of people, well, some people know, but for example, in the September 11th bombing on the Pentagon actually started preparing itself, not necessarily for an airplane flying into it, but it prepared itself for a potential bombing inside. And they reinforced the walls. They started hardening things, put in extra steel, put in extra protection throughout the building. Now, when the airplane came in, obviously they didn't plan for that, but they did go ahead, and the protection they did to stop a bomb significantly decreased the amount of death and other issues and damage that they would have incurred otherwise. Then obviously, boom, point to boom, you can have different things like bomb detectors. You can, for example, harden cockpit doors or whatever, and that's boom, right a boom, you have the response. You figure out, you know what? What happens if there's a secondary explosion? Unfortunately, like what happened with the Boston Marathon bombings. We can't just send responders in because they want to help people, but how do we do that responsibly in case there's secondary explosion? What if there's poisonous gas? What if there's radiation? How do we do things? How do we get things up and running? What about also making sure we have enough hospital beds for people and so on? And then also, if there's bad people involved, how do we close the city down? How do we close an area down to try to isolate the bad people and so on? It's a very complicated issue, and different professions and different technologies are used throughout the entire cycle. However, in cybersecurity, guess what, guys? You probably don't have that. But in the real world, though, they look at this as a comprehensive thing. In cybersecurity, we don't. That's one of our failings. We look at the user error as the human firewall. We look at it as making our users the last line of defense. Just no. Anyway, with 90% of attacks involving user compromise, if you focus on boom as a user action, and again, user action, think about the fact that you're going to stop 90% of most of the attacks. So again, phrasing this whole thing, boom is the user action that can initiate a loss. And this is one thing, as opposed to a user action, I started calling it user initiated loss, because a user doesn't cause damage or loss. The system as a whole allows for it to happen. It's not a user that deletes all the files on a system. It's the system operating system that delete the files. That's a critical distinction. They can type a command in. It doesn't mean the system should allow the command to execute, as a critical example. And too many people in the cybersecurity world, they just throw their hands up and say, you can't stop stupid. It's like, no, yes, you can stop stupid. That is your job, to stop stupid. And that's a critical difference than the way people currently act. It's your job to sound stupid. The user just initiates a potential loss. You, the system, has to allow the loss to be initiated. The system has to present the user with an opportunity. For example, a phishing message that contains ransomware, the system has to let the phishing message all the way through to the user. It then has to allow the user to initiate that by clicking on the ransomware, but then it has to allow the user to install the ransomware. It has to allow the ransomware to encrypt files all over the network and stuff. The user might initiate the execution of the ransomware, but the ransomware should not be successful if your network is secure by design. I guess zero trust is one aspect, but you understand what we're talking about. But either way, you want to stop the loss potential, but you also want to stop the loss from being realized. So anyway, really leave that here. So now when we're talking about users in cybersecurity environments, your goal is to prevent the user from being in a position to initiate the loss. In the ideal world, a user can't click on a phishing message, for example, if you stop the phishing message from getting there. For example, you can use DMARC to make sure your domains aren't being spoofed, as one example. You then go ahead and you have anti-malware, things that go ahead and delete messages before they get to the user. Then likewise, you're creating a culture, this is where, like, again, User awareness, I kind of say, is at the point of boom, but your awareness program also should create a culture as a whole that gets people to do the right things by default. You know, I keep using the example of when I worked at NSA, and this is kind of a left of boom issue to a certain extent, but when I worked at NSA, I had a badge I had to wear, and obviously, and then like to do my job at a point in time, I had to take off my badge, leave it on the desk while I used this plotter. The plotter had a mechanical arm, so you didn't want a dangling badge while you used it. Then I was like working shift work, 3 o'clock in the morning. I ran out to go use the restroom. When I was in the hallway, all of a sudden, guards stopped me, because guards do round at NSA. And the guard's like, "Where's your badge?" I'm like, "Oh." And then I like, "Oh, must be by my desk." He's like, "Okay, we're going to your office." I'm like, "You're not allowed anywhere near my office." He's like, "Then I'll wait by the main entrance." So guard followed me. I opened up the door and he held it ajar. I then went into my office within the office, and I kept looking for my badge, and my coworkers, all of us, after a while, goes, "Are you looking for something, Ira?" And I'm like, "Where's my effing badge?" He's like, "You mean the badge that should be around your neck?" I'm like, "Give me my fucking badge." And he's like, and then the guard's like, "Is there a problem?" And then finally the guy gave me the badge. I showed it to the guard. But do you think I ever went ahead and left my badge somewhere else? That was a culture. That was a painful lesson, but that was a lesson because there was the culture of wearing badges. So anyway, likewise, users can help you detect, for example, tailgaters and a whole bunch of other people, stop people who aren't wearing badges as an example. Anyway, then you have governance, and this is probably the key factor. All organization processes should be clearly defined. We don't do that in cybersecurity. We tell users, okay, well, do this, do that. Everybody should, again, every user should know how to do their job properly. And this is a failing of awareness. We're training people, and you'll see another slide, we're training people to be Elmer Fuds. Governance should say how a specific job is done from start to finish. It should define security throughout the entire process, before it gets to a user, once it's at a user, and then after the user has their impact on the process, there should be governance regarding that. But again, the whole process should be planned out in advance, and if you do governance right, you might even be able to take users out of the process to begin with. And if a user is not in the process, they can't initiate a loss. Now we're at the point of boom. The user is presented with the opportunity to initiate a loss. Now this goes to, do we have a good user experience? Do we guide the users to do things properly? Are there warnings? Are there indicators, like this is an external email in the case of phishing messages, as an example, to get people to do things right? But at this point, hey, this might be where awareness is. Do they do the action? Do they detect it? Do they prevent it? Do they let people know? From, there's an attack in process, those are critical. Remember, any of this can be accidental, careless, willful, malicious, or forced. And what I mean by forced is maybe a bad guy is forcing somebody to do something for whatever reason. You don't know what's going on. But you have to assume the action itself, the initiation of a loss, you can't attribute a reason to it at this time. And frankly, again, the reason is irrelevant at this point. And like I mentioned before, with awareness programs, a good awareness program is supposed to embody the process and tell people how to implement the process. The reality, though, we're training people in awareness to be Elmer Fuds. Always be on the lookout for the wascally wabbit. Always tell people, here's the, be on the lookout for the bad guy. And your users are doing what you tell them. They're like, is this that hacker I was told about? It's like, no, hackers do things this way. And they're not telling me to do things this way. This was completely a different way. So clearly it's not the hacker. Again, the concept is users should be doing things right. They shouldn't be afraid about what's going to go wrong. If you tell users how to implement governance properly, how to do their job properly, they're not sitting there. Because think about it this way. The criminals you're facing, if you're dealing with a phishing message, you're dealing with whatever, you're dealing with bad guys trying to steal information, you're likely dealing with, organized criminals, sociopaths, well-funded organizations. You don't want a low-level employee being your front line of defense against an organized criminal. And that's what happens. Whether or not this is like the Russian mafia, or it's just kind of like a low-level gang that's trying to get ransomware for the first time, it doesn't matter. But your users should be thinking, what is the right way to do things, not who should I be afraid of? Then we get to write-a-boom. Write-a-boom, the loss has been initiated. For whatever reason, the user did something that if you don't stop it is going to set off a sequence of events. And how do you do things like that? You set up your environment properly. You go ahead, users don't have admin privileges as an example. You put in data leak prevention, you put in web content filtering, you have limited accesses for users who don't need the accesses and so on. Are there additional protections? Are you using user and entity behavioral analytics? Are you looking for the initiation of damage? Are you looking for this? And then are you proactively stopping it? Because a user, I get involved in these arguments about awareness being, people claim awareness is a waste of money. I still think it's one of the best uses and should have a legitimate budget. And yeah, people who say users should click on everything and it should be irrelevant. You know what? To a large extent, they're right. But that should not be your entire program. Again, one of the problems is you have people working in silos. You have some people who focus on left-to-boom type of cyber activities. You have the awareness people who focus on the point-to-boom. Then you have other people who focus on right-to-boom, like your engineers, your people doing data leak prevention, and so on. All these people are focusing in silos. But the problem is you should never rely upon one point of failure, such as letting users click on everything. That's as stupid as, the other way around. So anyway, most important, do a postmortem. Go back, analyze the incident, what caused the incident, what enabled it. But here's the critical factor. The proximity of the incident is not the cause of the incident. The proximity is the symptom of the incident. And you have to figure out what led to that incident from happening at the proximity, and then figure out after the proximity of the error or the proximity of the initiation, what could have stopped that? And you go back and you figure out, okay, how did we get lucky? That's another key factor. What stopped the attack from being worse? What made the attack better? Where could we have detected the attack, and so on? Because this is your best incidents. I hate to say, can be a hidden blessing. If you have a low-level incident, in some ways, the Twitter hack, where you have this teenager doing a phishing attack called a mastermind because the security was incompetent. But, in the Twitter hack, for all you had this teenager finding this major problem and essentially just selling it for other people to do Bitcoin theft. In theory, if something like this happened, like somebody took over Biden, Obama's, and Trump's Twitter accounts at just the wrong moment in time, that could be election meddling in a major way. And perhaps this idiot teenager who did this, not the mastermind, but the idiot, went ahead and the discussion and the investigation might have saved much more damage than could have otherwise been done should Russians, Iranians, Chinese, or whoever else wanted to manipulate the election at the wrong moment. Again, doing a post-mortem, that might sound like a lot of work, but safety science does it every time. Accounting, if you have a large loss, there's a whole bunch of accountants, there's a whole bunch of CFOs and consultants that come in and figure out why a major loss happened. There's an outage in operations again, like for example, what happened with Cloudflare a few months ago. There's like major analysis on why there were lots of losses. In cybersecurity, it's like, oh, that's the stupid user. What, we can't stop that stupid user. No, you can stop the stupid user, or you're the stupid one. Anyway, like I mentioned before, if you're stopping, users are 90% of the incidents. And if you can stop, or what I mean by 90% of the incidents, 90% of incidents involve users as the primary attack vector. In other words, they're the way into the system. And the reason they're the way in is not because the users are stupid, but because you're stupid in constructing the protections around the user. And if you can nail that down and stop that 90%, odds are pretty good you're going to stop the other 10% as well. I use the example of CEO fraud, W-2, CornCon, you're likely all US people, but you know, think of it this way. You go ahead and you decide to, for example, a criminal goes ahead and they send in a message saying, I'm the CEO. I need you, Mr. Low-level HR person, to send my new accounting firm all the W-2 information as an example. And that attack goes through. And then what happens is, what should happen left of boom? You should be doing email filtering. Maybe DMARC will weed this out. Your your email filter should take the message away. Likewise, you should tag messages as external if they're coming from outside the company. It's possible that some bad guy might compromise email accounts. That's a different sequence. But generally, if they're coming from outside the company and sending this in, you should start filtering out these attacks as best you can, and then providing for a user experience simultaneously that gives the users at least a fighting chance. But then when it gets to the user, for a W-2 thing, you shouldn't have a low-level person randomly saying, you know what? Hey, the CEO has reached out to me personally. I'm going to send out PII, personally identifiable information. Again, that should not be the case. You should not have a low-level person being on the front line against a trained criminal, a sociopath who wants to steal millions of dollars, no matter what. So what should the low-level person do? They're like, this is a release of PII. I can't do that. The only person who could do that is the head of HR. They also need general counsel protection. What I'm at a low-level analyst going to do, I don't care if it's the CEO, I'm giving it to the head of HR, and they're going to make a decision. And then if they make the decision and then they can, for example, convince the general counsel to release it, I hate to say it, but the criminal might have earned that crime. The reality of the situation is that's not going to happen most of the time. It's going to be filtered out. Somebody's going to say, hey, wait a second, this isn't from the CEO. Let's check this out. But either way, let's assume that somehow the criminal goes ahead and does all this and gets the general counsel to approve everything. You should be able to have right a boom. There's warnings of attaching the file. Data leak prevention software goes ahead and filters out the attachment before it gets sent out of the company and so on, so people can look at it. This is a systems approach, and that's the key term, a systems approach to stopping what I'm referring to as user-initiated loss. You might refer to it as stupidity. But likewise, if you look at it this way, handling PII, handling a PII, in general, can not just stop this W-2 fraud, but a variety of different types of attacks against the organization. Data leak prevention might stop the W-2 type of attack, but it's also going to stop lots of things like customer data leaking out, sensitive information being sent out accidentally, and so on. It's going to stop a whole bunch of different loss. Filtering of incoming messages on servers, again, stops so much. Tagging a mail as external can stop a lot of random attacks against your organization. Warning of attachments could be like, hey, wait a second, I didn't do this. It's going to, again, there's so much overlap if you start looking at one type of user-initiated loss compared to losses across your organization. I've already beat this to death, but if you can mitigate 90%, you're going to probably catch a lot of the remaining 10% as well, not just because we're dealing with a user error, but because we've hardened the system as a whole. That's the key factor. We're not looking at it as a user-related issue. We're looking at it as a systems issue, and as a result, we've hardened the whole system. Now, awareness is still mandatory. I mentioned this. Everybody says, oh, you just went through a whole bunch of reasons why awareness is like not as valuable as addressing the system. Here's the thing. Everything along the way will fail. Awareness is a good risk reduction tool. For a user to click on a phishing message, your entire pre-left-a-boom technology has to fail. Pretty much you allowed a bad message to get through. So in other words, your email filtering did nothing. The expensive email gateway did nothing. But if a user's looking at it, a user can, in the right circumstances, and I've been involved in situations like this, can stop millions of dollars of damage proactively. So you got to go ahead and make sure users know how to do everything right. Every time a user doesn't click on a phishing message, every time a user doesn't open up their spam file, every time users do things right, it's a success story, but we don't report on that. Because you really, again, left of boom has failed, and you can't make sure right of boom is going to be any more successful than left of boom. So you got to make sure you do risk reduction throughout the entire chain of events. Anyway, and this is the key thing. Are you throwing around tactics, or do you have a strategy? Because again, like I mentioned before, you have one team that might do email gateways, you have another team doing awareness, you have another team doing data leak prevention and the other technologies. Who's looking at this as a strategy? Again, all too frequently you have CISOs and other people, and again, they're trying to make the most of their budget, but they have to look at things a different way, given the scope of the errors and the losses that we're looking at. So again, look to pursue a strategy of mitigating user-initiated loss, and you're going to stop a lot of damage. Now, again, the most important takeaway, here's the key thing. I didn't mention this, but you want to make sure a canary doesn't just die from a heart attack. It would be bad if you empty out an entire coal mine and it just so happens the canary had a heart attack. That's bad. On the other hand, the canary is just the proximity of the problem in general. You don't want healthier canaries. You want to make sure a canary dies when they're supposed to die. Likewise, your users are just part of the system. And no, you don't want your users to die. But in the reality, you don't want them to make an error. But if they make an error, the error is just a result of the entire system, not their own actions. And here's the key takeaway of the entire presentation. My new book, You Can't Stop Stupid, is now available for order on Amazon.com and Better Things Elsewhere. Made a nice little quick link and everything. Buy my book. It's awesome. Well, at least pre-order it now. Anyway, that's probably it. John, are you there, and do you have any questions?
I'm here. I don't have any questions. Yeah, we're definitely out of time. I want to wrap things up and thank our speaker. Thank you. Thank all of our speakers and our sponsors and all of our attendees for making this a real successful conference.